Welcome back. All right, so anytime during the year, you will see arguments amongst fans both online and in person about players who are overrated or underrated. And you may have good reasons why you believe one player is underrated, and somebody opposite of you may have very good reasons why they believe that player is overrated. And so it gets into a whole discussion. This is why I don't do videos on players being overrated. I will talk about underrated because I do believe there are certain players in the NHL that are kind of overlooked, but I'm not going to get into overrated because to me it comes across as mean spirited and it also comes across as hating, and I'm not going to jump into that. Now, what causes a player to be over or underrated? Really, it's the same things, just a different way of looking at it. So we'll start with goals and points. You can have players that get a lot of goals who aren't necessarily great players, players with a lot of points who aren't necessarily great players either. They're just good at generating the offense. And on the defensive side, they're a nightmare and they cause more problems than they solve. So again, as a fan, you might look at that player and go, I love the offense, but his defense is so bad, I think he's overrated. And a player on the other side might say, look, he got 110 points last year, so I think he's underrated by you. I think he's a fantastic player, and defensively, you got other players to do that. That's not what he's paid for. The one that really stands out to me when we get into overrated, underrated, fights and hits. Going back to the 80s, some of the most popular players in the game were fighters. They weren't necessarily great puck handlers. They weren't necessarily guys who got goals. And they might have only played 5 minutes per game, if that. There were players who would play 3 or 4 minutes per game as enforcers, but they were really popular because they could fight. They could win fights. And they could throw big hits. Sometimes controversial hits, but big hits. And so there are players who get overrated because of their fighting and their hitting. Also, there are players who are underrated because they don't fight and they don't hit. So you get a player who's a really good player, and then somebody will answer with, well, yeah, but he doesn't fight. He doesn't hit. He won't drop the gloves. He doesn't defend himself. So you get both sides of the argument there as well, right? And it's just two different ways of looking at the game. I can't recall a single time I've looked at a player and said, you know what? I wish he punched more guys in the head. I can't recall thinking that about a player. It's the reason that the movie Youngblood lost me 20 minutes in. If you haven't watched Youngblood, there are hockey fans that like it. I'm not a hockey fan that did. Flashy play. So this is a debate we get into when we talk about guys like Svechnikov in Carolina, Zegras in Anaheim. Is it all flash, no substance? And there is that argument about certain players that when you look at their numbers, you look at the goals and points, they aren't necessarily fantastic. However, they have a lot of flashy plays. And there are players that I've talked about, both in career videos, during recaps and reviews, where you can see this talent, this underlying ability that's just fantastic, but they're not quite there. And yet they have the really big flashy plays that tell you what they can do. It's just they're not consistently doing that, right? So it's easy to look at those flashy plays and maybe overrate a player. It is also easy to dismiss a player and say, well, he's just flashy plays, which again, with Svechnikov and Zegras, I've seen that argument on the other side as well, right? And there are other players who fall into this category of when they hit a play and they hit it really well, it's spectacular. And, they're also players who don't do anything flashy, they just produce. And so they may not get all the attention, they may not get all of the accolades, but they produce and they do it well. It doesn't matter whether you do a fantastic lacrosse move or you just push it over the goal line from 3 feet away. Both goals count for the same amount. Reputation. So this is one that I've noticed as well, and this cuts both ways. There are players that are overrated by their name. So you look and you go, that player's great. He might be 35 years of age. His points and goals might be declining badly. He might be a lot slower than what he was, but people look at that name and they go, hey, he's a good player. I'm really surprised that he signed for as cheap as he did. That team got a steal. And you can't make the argument to some of these people about how all the totals are dropping because they are a fan of that player and they're not going to change their mind on that. But there's also the negative reputation. The players who, and I would use Matt Cook as an example of a player who had a bad reputation. Wouldn't have mattered what he did. He could have gone out there. He could have scored and I'm not saying he did because he didn't. If Matt Cook had a 40-goal season, people would have been like, yep, guess what? He's still Matt Cook. So there's definitely some reputation there, which will knock people down. Some players, I think, get negative points for their reputation, and then some that get positive for their reputation as well. And it's always fascinating to me when a trade takes place or a signing takes place to look at the comment section on here and just in general online and see how often people will say he's a great player. And it very often is based on what they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or cumulatively through their career. And so we can get caught up in the name and not necessarily look at the stats, look at their age and say, going forward, they may not be as effective as what they were. We see who they are, we see what they've done, and their reputation can carry them a long way. Location, location, location. If you have a player who's playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, he is going to get a lot of attention. He may get overhyped, he may be underhyped, he may be overly criticized because of where he is. If you have a player in Arizona, he may have to wear a name tag when he's out in public because people may not know who he is, right? And that's just how that is. And you're going to have players who are in small markets or markets don't get as much attention that are underrated. And so if you cheer for a team that doesn't get a lot of attention and you're like, I really wish this player got more attention around the NHL, odds are they would get that if they went to Vegas, New York to play for the Rangers. In specifically, I would think the Rangers. Some hype in New Jersey and the Islanders as well, but definitely the Rangers. Toronto, Montreal, here in Vancouver. A lot more attention when you play for those teams. Minnesota, I guess, would qualify. Colorado, too. So it really depends on location as to whether or not a player might be overrated or underrated. And it's funny because it cuts both ways. I have seen players play for teams like New York, Toronto, Montreal, who I have felt were overrated by media or fans, and also ones that I thought took too much criticism because they were in these big markets and they were under the spotlight all the time. So it can cut both ways. Advanced stats. Advanced stats are great. I really enjoy advanced stats. Advanced stats also, they're a measurement taken with humans involved. Like, advanced stats, generally speaking, are another tool that you can use to go through and say, this guy's a hidden gem. Look at these numbers. Or this guy's overrated. Look what these numbers tell us. So basically, advanced stats are with the mind of telling us this formula that might help you win a championship. So going back to the Oakland A's, the Houston Rockets, teams in other sports, the Boston Red Sox, who use these analytics in order to get themselves further ahead in their leagues, to have a bit of an advantage. The thing is, it does feel like almost all 32 teams now are using advanced stats. Some of them have their own stats in-house and their own numbers that they're using. I would think that will increase as well, that eventually every team will have their own stats they don't share, and then we'll still have sites like Money Puck and others that have that advanced stats stuff that's fun to look at. It's fun to look at. But advanced stats tell you, and again, I will say this, I think it's part of the picture. I don't think it tells the entire picture. But is it all subjective? Yes. So there's that part too, where it is subjective in the end. Cup rings. So this again can come from both sides. This player has 3 Stanley Cup rings. Therefore, he is better than insert name of player that doesn't have any. You can also make the counter argument of this player doesn't have any cup rings, but he's underrated because the teams he's played for haven't been good enough to win a Stanley Cup anyways. So he might get paid less than the guy with 3 cup rings, but really he's worth just as much or more because, and then you talk about goals and points, fights and hits, flashy play, reputation. See, all of these things can come into it, but cup rings can cause a player to be overrated. How many times have we seen a player get picked up, might be a depth forward, depth defenseman, and one of the first things mentioned is he has a cup ring. He has 2 cup rings. He brings Stanley Cup experience, and he might have been the number 6 defenseman. I'm not saying that's not, that disqualifies him from being a good influence and helping your team, but I do think sometimes that gets overblown. We just watched Vegas win a Stanley Cup. How many players had previous experience with Stanley Cups? There were definitely a few there, but it's not like players who did not have a Stanley Cup already were passengers just watching those other players. So you need a mix of players. The cup rings are nice, but it can be overrated. And then the one that I always, and I've talked about this on the channel before as well, is the overhyped, and I use the term young guns on purpose because this dates back to the upper deck cards back in the early 90s. First time you had young guns, that's Sergei Fedorov. You pull that out of a pack, especially if it's a French pack. You might have a card worth $120, which you'd better have sold at the time because then the market dropped out of it. But there's definitely a lot of hype for rookies. It is this this clean slate that a rookie gets when they come into the league. And we're going to see a lot of that with the rookie tournaments this weekend and this week. And then going into, the preseason and all of the hype around kids. And they can be overrated. There are also times that young players come in and they're underrated. And I always find it interesting because those first-round draft picks, those hype prospects, I don't think they necessarily get the amount of criticism that some of the projects get. Where you'll say, well, yeah, his skating needs some work, but he was a top 5 pick and he really projects quite well. So maybe he eases his way in. And then, somebody else who might be in the exact same position, you go, hey, he's more of a project. He's not really expected to be in the NHL anyways, so I think his skating's holding him back. He probably ends up in the AHL. And they might have the exact same skill set. They might have very similar numbers. And the guy that we're saying he may end up in the AHL might actually be having a better preseason than that top 5 prospect. But the hype can be huge. And then what happens is you get that hype around the young players, and then if they don't quite live up to our expectations, immediately throw bust, project, guy sucks, this is terrible, this is awful. You can throw it back on the organization and say clearly they don't know how to develop. But it is amazing to me how quickly the hype for young guns will dissipate. It can disappear within a month. So you have an 18-year-old get drafted, maybe he makes the NHL at 19, fans are all excited, and a month into his career, people are like, well, clearly we overrated him, he sucks. And at that point, that's where I say, you know what, they're underrating him now because he has a lot of time to turn things around. He's 19. So to me, I don't think you can really give up on a player completely. I would say until, I would say 22 or 23 is when you could say with a top prospect, well, it's clearly not going to work out. Depending on position, especially if it's a defenseman, you can let him, learn his trade in the minors. Sometimes players come up later as defensemen, goaltenders as well. But that's what causes the hype. Now, if you really want to get fans going, and if you can't get them to agree with you that a player's underrated, just say, he does the little things. What's nice about saying he does the little things, you don't have to say what they are. You just say, well, he does the little things right. He's, you see him in the corners, and, in front of the, fighting in front of the net. He does the little things. And so it may not show up on the scoreboard, and yeah, he may not be the fastest skater, but he does the little things right. And there's no counter-argument to that, really. And then leadership. Leadership is also something that we discuss. We've, of course, got a couple of teams naming captains over the last few days, and you get into the discussion of leadership, which I honestly think in today's National Hockey League, it's no longer a league where you have one captain. I really believe that there's leadership groups in each team. You do have somebody who wears the C, and they're the one who goes and talks to the referee during stoppages, talks to him during, about penalty calls, and talks to the media after the game. But there has to be a leadership group within a team. So I sometimes think that we talk about captains and overrate the influence they have on the team. I think it's more about the leadership group. You have your alternate captains. You have your starting goaltender can be a part of that leadership group too, even though he's not going to be an alternate captain. And there's various parts of a roster that can really help with leadership. You've got your veterans. It can be a depth guy further down the lineup. It can be somebody with a cup ring who can tell a story to the team to really bring them up and something inspirational, that kind of thing. But overrated against underrated, it is difficult to argue who's overrated, who's underrated. And so, again, I don't like to talk about who I feel is overrated. Are there players I think are overrated? Maybe a little bit. There may be a few, but in general, I like to focus on who I think's underrated, who isn't getting attention, who should be. And that's one of the things with watching as much hockey as I do. I try to talk about during the regular season and focus on players that I think are having under the radar really good seasons. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. What is your least favorite part of trying to argue with somebody about who's overrated and underrated? And which do you think is the most likely to cause a player to be overrated or underrated? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.